Look at me. You might wonder how a well-seasoned white woman can speak about bias, about prejudice, and yes, about racism. Things may not be all that dramatic in my life, but what you don't see are my strong beliefs, my lived experiences, and my passion. I want to tell you 2 stories and some historical background. Now we can go to that cute little girl. That's me. My very first encounter with racism was when I was 4 years old. My grandparents drove us out to Ann Arbor, and we stopped on a warm summer day. We stopped at a playground, and my grandparents walked me over to a swing set. And I hopped on a swing and I soared toward the clouds. I was feeling so free and so happy. A little girl joined me on the swing next to me. And we laughed and we giggled as we could see who could swing higher than the other. Suddenly, my grandmother came over and snatched me off that swing and said, "You are not to play with those people." And I was stunned. "What people?" And she pointed to my friend. I didn't understand, but my friend's mom sure did, as she took her daughter out of that playground. You have to understand, my friend was African American. I was wailing. I was so upset. My grandmother dragged me to the car, and while she was taking me to the car, she said, "You are not to associate with those people. You just don't understand." And then she proceeded to call my friends names that I had never heard before. I sat frozen in the back seat of that car, and I was just so upset. And I said, "Grandma, you are not nice." You know, I feel things very deeply. And some may say too deeply. But that's the strength of empathy. I may not have the lived experience, but I certainly can be sensitive to those experiences of others. Growing up in the 1960s, I was tremendously influenced by the civil rights movement. What that meant with being from a suburb in Detroit was that I could be sensitive to the experiences of others. The inhumane treatment of people of color has been perpetuated for centuries, particularly in this country. The pain from in the 20th century, the pain from the discriminatory federal policies, what they've had on African Americans, cannot be overstated. It has been well documented by researchers, by scholars, and the people who have lived those experiences. The Federal Housing Act of 1934 was part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. The hope was that this would help the country come out of the Great Depression and end the economic crisis. This act created the Federal Housing Administration. And one of the purposes of the FHA was to ensure mortgages for lower income Americans through financial institutions. Owning a home was, and still is, a path to wealth creation and financial security. Redlining was a practice that came out of this. And what redlining was to note those areas in cities where it was considered safe for these insured mortgages. On maps, those areas that were predominantly African American and other people of color, those were noted in red. There have been many books and articles written about this over the decades. The most recent that I've read was in 2014. A historian, Richard Rothstein, wrote the book, The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Rothstein notes that the federal government had made the premise of how they could justify segregation, the mistaken premise that if African Americans move into a primarily white neighborhood, that housing values would go down. Simply not true. Like many American cities, Detroit raised a number of African American neighborhoods in the 1950s and 60s under the name of urban renewal. Urban renewal leveled many areas of cities, including Detroit. Lives uprooted, people displaced. It was something else. Public leaders at that time noted that if we could remove the blight, without regard to the people who live there, that this could put a shine on the facade of a city. Well, underneath that shine and underneath that facade, a lot of hurt, anger, and devastation. One such neighborhood in the Detroit area was Black Bottom. This is a quite notable and famous area. This was adjacent to downtown Detroit. It was filled with businesses, homes, people. It was a predominantly African American neighborhood. Well, that was leveled, making way for a freeway spur and for high-rise apartments. So when you think about these discriminatory practices and policies, and how lives particularly in Detroit, where they were squeezed by the continuation of building our interstate freeways, you can imagine the despair and the anger that helped fuel what we've been conditioned to call the Detroit riots in 1967. I prefer to call it an uprising. In 1968, I had a part-time job, a summer job at the Detroit News. My father, an editor at the News, he and I were driving home one evening, and we were driving through on a street that was out of downtown Detroit. It was lively. It was a hot summer night. People were walking around, visiting with one another on porches, and just it was a vibrant area. Just a week later, that was all leveled. Once again, lives uprooted and dispersed. People dispersed to other areas. So what impact has this had on me now? Well, I certainly have become much more knowledgeable over these decades about the conditions that contribute to racism. Disparities continue to this day. Development is encroaching many neighborhoods. Rents are rising, housing values, housing prices are rising, making many urban neighborhoods unaffordable for many people. In 2017, the Kellogg Foundation funded a racial equity profile done by PolicyLink and PAIR. This equity profile was here in the city of Grand Rapids. One of the findings was that diverse groups are fueling growth and change in large numbers in this area. Black and Latinos are twice as often to be unemployed than white residents. Wages have declined since 1979, but in particular for those in the lower half of the wage distribution. You know, I continue to advocate for change in both my professional and private life. I can't undo the past, but I can certainly influence the future. My mantra for years has been to listen for understanding, which I gotta tell you can be darn tough when I'm talking to somebody whose opinion I don't share. I've grown in my understanding of how it feels to be marginalized, but I have a long ways to go. Growth as it relates to racial, economic, and social justice isn't just the right thing to do. It's what fuels my passion to strengthen our community. My position at Grand Rapids Community Foundation allows me the opportunity to create those pathways for people for a more equitable life. I've learned to be an ally, to continue to speak out, and speak out I do, and have great experience with being uncomfortable from making mistakes. But the aha in all of this is that that people who have the lived experience will help shape how we move forward. We need to amplify community voice in ways we have never done before. We need to close the wealth gap. We need to create job opportunities and to grow affordable housing and much more. It means having the tough conversations, making all communities those places where people can be their best selves and live their biggest dreams. As we say at the foundation, it is only by reaching across all perspectives and overcoming inequities that we can build and sustain an inclusive economy and thriving community. The time for change is long, long overdue. To grow as a human being means to always being ready to learn, to listen for understanding, and to act. This isn't just a why can't we get along moment. I want the future to be so much better for my 4-year-old friend from long ago. So I ask you to be engaged in community and connect in real time with people to help lift up our next generation. As Serena Williams says, don't wait to be given power, because here's what they won't tell you. You already have it. Now that you know you have the power, what are you going to do? Listen, learn, act, embrace. Thank you.